Hi everyone and welcome back to Chess for Charity. In this video, you're going to learn an important endgame maneuver where you have the white rook against two passed pawns. So I want you to take a second and see if you can figure out the objectively correct result in this position. By that I mean, if both sides play perfectly, which side will win or will it be a draw? So white has a rook and black has two pawns, and they're going down the board, a couple squares away from promotion. Your job is to figure out what is the best path forward for white. Can white draw? Can white win? Or is black going to win by force? Okay, so take a second to figure that out. If you want to pause the video, now's your chance. If not, stick along and I'll just keep going. Okay, in this position, there's actually only one move that draws for white. And I'm going to show you a couple of alternatives first. So when you see this rook here, you might think to check the king here to try to push them away from these pawns. Or you might think to go behind the rook, bring the rook behind the pawns and maybe try to attack them this way. Okay, either one of those doesn't really work here, so let's just show why really quickly. If you play rook c1, this doesn't really do much because king d4, and I'm pushing these pawns forward. This king is too far away, and after you do this, what do? You really don't have any good options. You want to try to drop back to give checks. That's not going to be a problem because I can always avoid the checks like this. And you keep checking me, I find shelter behind my own pawn. I'm pushing a pawn through next, and if you take it, that's fine, I have another one. Right? Okay, so that doesn't work. This idea of rook c1 doesn't work. Well, maybe you thought the other way, which is bring the rook behind first. So I think it's a good idea in general to keep your rook behind the opponent's passed pawns, but in this case it doesn't really work because these advanced passed pawns are only 2 squares away. And in this case, kind of like I was saying before, it's just too slow. e2, you gotta get behind this one. King c3, you could even play d2 in that position. And king g5, right? King g4, what do you want to do? Get closer? Like this or like this? Doesn't really matter. This works. And then what? How do you stop it? You don't stop it, right? Okay. So those moves don't work. So what is the right move? Well, it turns out in this position it's a king move. It's king g4. This is the only move that draws. And you might go, okay, how does that work? Because in this position, I was curious about 4 variations. This king move, getting closer to this pawn. This king move, getting closer to this pawn. And of course, the more obvious, d2 or e2. So let's look at these king moves first. So it turns out, these king moves actually lose for black. So if you play king c3, that's not a good idea because king f3, and I'm attacking this pawn. And how do you guard it? Well, you can either play the king or you can move the pawn. But in either case, it's all going to kind of crumble down because of Zugzwang. So let me show that. So if you push this, really cool move here, rook h1, saying I'm watching you and you can't do anything about it. And if this pawn goes to push, of course you could just take this. So maybe you think move the king. But after the king f2 move, what's happening here? You're making black move backwards. So they move back, you move in. And look at this. This is going to be a win for white. You push the pawn, I take it. You push this pawn, I take that one. Right? And you can't really move the king. You move the king here, nothing wrong with that. Rook e1. Again, look at, I'm just putting you in Zugzwang. King goes back. What do? Rook c1. You want to go this way? Look at how you're just suffocating the pieces. Look at that. You see how instructive that is? Endgames like this, I learned so much. Okay, so you can't get away with this king move. Okay, after this king move, you can't get away right there. Here it is. You can't get away with this king move, right? Because if you do that, I have a tempo on this pawn. I'm attacking it. And if you go to defend it, it doesn't work. If you go to push it, it doesn't work. There are all sorts of variations, but there's no need to show all of them. You pretty much get the point. like I was saying, it's going to be a zugzwang situation here, just like the other one, right? And just like before, it's pretty much the same position as before. Okay, so let's look at the other variation. We can look at what happens after I move this king. We looked at this one briefly. Let's look at d4 briefly as well. So this will again lose for black because after king f3, I'm so close to these pawns and there's nothing you can do about it. You want to push this pawn forward because this guy's being defended? Well, what did you just do there? You move this pawn. That gave up this key square. I got this now. You want to move in? That's fine. I have enough, right? I can just take this and I'm right here. Do you see that? Okay. Let's go back. So what about the actual variations that force the hand a little bit? What about d2 and e2? And this is really where this key maneuver comes in. This is the endgame principle you have to know. So pay attention here if you haven't paid attention so far. d2 or e2. Let's say you play e2, saying I'm going to attack your rook, and if you move your rook away, I can always push this guy and then promote. It's a good idea. So in this position, there's only one move that draws for white. It's the move rook c1. Okay, now why is this the move that draws? Well, it's all about time. So let's just say the king goes this way to approach the rook. We can look at this way as well. If they do that, take the color off the board. If they do that, king f3, and here's what's so cool. If they play d2, looks scary, right? Look at this. What do? Rook b1 check, and you're like, okay, I don't get that. That only brings me closer. Ready for this move? King e2. King takes e2, saying, you can give up my rook. Remember, the goal is to draw the game. That's a draw. So this whole maneuver, a lot of these lines, you end up giving up your rook to get the draw. So what if they don't go to b3? What if instead they go toward the pawns, like this? Same idea. King b3. I'm eyeing this one. So, but again, you might say, what if I do this? Well, it's the same idea, but it's such a cool variation. Now there's no check here. Instead, there's a check right here. Bang. That's a huge check. You have to take me, right? Well, I guess you don't have to, but if you move away, it's the same exact idea. I'll take that next. So you take me, and that buys me just enough time to take this pawn and this guy next. You want to hold on to it? This is going to be a draw. You have no moves except this one, which is going to be stalemate. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing this theme here. The theme is you can give up your rook to get both of these pawns. So an important lesson if you see these endgames more often, because I see them a lot. Okay, so after this king move, we looked at the king c3 move, we looked at king d4 move, and we looked at e2. What about d2? Okay, well, same idea. It looks like a little scary, but after king f3, you can't push this pawn forward, you can't push this pawn forward. The only sensible move here is king d3. But here's another just amazing quiz for you. One move draws here. Only one. What is it? You want to try to figure it out? Feel free to pause the video. While you're at it, please subscribe, by the way. I should have said that already. So, rook b1 doesn't work. Rook c1 doesn't work. e1, f1, g1, h1. None of those work. Only rook a1. Now, why, you might wonder? Well, black's next move, you of course want to push these pawns. e2, but after rook a3 check, you have to leave the defense of this pawn, like this. But, of course, that's probably fine. Do you take this pawn? Well, if you do, look what happens. You lose. Promote. You lose that. You don't take the pawn. Instead, the reason why you went to a1, you give check again. And you might go, okay, I don't get that because I'm just going to let the king approach me. And that's correct. You are letting the king approach you. That's the whole point. So after king b1, attacking your rook, just like before, take, and if they take you, you take them. And that's a draw. So in every single variation, it's going to be a draw. So what is the moral of the story here? And I really want to make sure this comes through if you haven't really gathered it yet. The point is, when you have a rook against 2 pawns, if you can get the rook sacrificed for the 2 pawns that are really far advanced, do it. Because if you can't stop them, you're going to lose. And it's not always 2 pawns for a rook. Of course, if the rook and the pawns are farther away, it's a different situation. But these pawns are deadly, about to promote, and there's only one maneuver that can help you win. Or, if they're playing best, can help you draw. So hopefully you learned something from that endgame. I know that I've learned a lot reviewing it. But that's it for this video. If you enjoy the content, be sure to consider subscribing. I put new videos out all the time, and my whole goal is to help spread the game of chess and to help charity. That's it for now. Thanks so much. Bye.